everyone. My name is Charlie Carroll, and I am the founding pastor here at City Church. I said that with emphasis because sometimes I don't get it right. I've had different titles in the past. I'm now the founding pastor here at City Church, where our purpose is to help people experience the fullness of God's love through relationship. Thank you for being here this morning, and thank you to all of you who are joining us from wherever you are via Facebook this morning. We're happy to have you here. We are jumping back into our series this morning in the book of Colossians, but first let me draw your attention to a new schedule. Starting December, we're just going to rearrange the breakouts that we have here in person with the sermon. And so starting in December, we're going to do a little trial run and put the sermon right after worship. So that means those of you that are tuning in via Facebook, in December, we will start at 9:30 instead of 10 a.m. And then if you're here, we're going to come into this room first before we go to the breakouts. We will put this in the email. We'll have this on the website. We'll talk about it more the closer we get to December. But just a piece of information for you to put in the back of your hat. I want to tell you a story that I thought about this past week. A couple of years ago, my wife and I went to a concert in Columbus with a well-known or nationally known band that was there. And we went to dinner beforehand, and I just thought that we had time, more time than we did. I did not think it was going to be this line or that it would be hard getting in. And so we got there with about 30 minutes before the concert started, and when we got there, it looked like what you're seeing in the picture. For those of you that can't see the picture, it's just a group of people wrapped around a building trying to get in. And that's what we found when we got to this concert, that like the line was forever long. You could not see the end of it. And so then I thought to myself, like, I don't know how long it will take us to go through this line. I'm going to test something that I've always wanted to test, and that is working in the security industry myself. I have always found that if you act like you know what you're talking about, people will just listen to you. And so I told the rest of the group to stay right where they were and watch for my phone call in case what I was going to try worked. And so sure enough, I walked around to the back of the venue, and I saw a staircase where you could go and get into the facility. And so I crossed the... I don't recommend trying this at home. This is only for security professionals. And so sure enough, I went up the stairs, and I was going to go through the door, and a security professional at the bottom of the stairs confronted me, and he said, "I'm sorry, what are you doing?" And I went on to act like I knew what I was talking about, and I asked him if he knew where the spotlight was. And when he did not know where the spotlight was, I asked him for his manager, knowing that his manager probably would not be around. And so I'm talking to him about this, acting as if I'm his superior, because again, I have been in charge of venues like this before myself, and so I knew the questions to ask. And he said, looking past me, he goes, "Oh, good, here comes my supervisor right now." Long story short, I was able to convince his supervisor that I even knew what I was doing. And we went in the back entrance to the venue and enjoyed ourselves. I do not recommend trying that at home, but it reminds me of something that we're going to learn in our passage this morning, and that we've been talking about here in the book of Colossians, and that is that you might be able to play the part in order to get into a concert or something else, but when it comes to the kingdom, which is where all of the resources that God has for you and has for me, you can't play that part. You can't fake that. You can't go and take those things. And so we're going to jump back into our text and look at the book of Colossians this morning. We'll be in the second chapter. And I just want to remind you, if you're tuning in for the first time, that nothing glorifies God more or makes God happier than you functioning at your full potential. We could talk theology for hours about what God expects of us. We could talk about what you've heard and what you've tried, but I just want to make it really, really simple, and it should make sense for anyone that has loved ones, especially those that have children and grandchildren. There is nothing that makes you happier than your children functioning at their full capacity. And so when mankind enters the story and is a part of telling God's story and God's love for us, it has always been easy for the story to be manipulated in order to serve people versus keep the purity of the story clear and clean. And so I just want to remind you that nothing glorifies God more than you functioning at your full capacity. We've said that energy, not evangelism, should be at the epicenter of Christianity. That when you really understand Colossians and you jump into chapter 1 like we've spent the last 2 weeks, we hear that this energy existed from the beginning and that it was God's energy, and that energy, Jesus used that energy to create absolutely everything. And so just practically speaking, it would make a lot of sense to understand that it is energy, full energy, that best represents God. And this can look like love. This can look like compassion. This can look like mercy. This can look like going out of your way to help someone else. This can also look like you knowing your own gifts and functioning at your own full capacity. And so we're going to jump into the second chapter this morning, and we're going to cover verses 11 through 15. This is Colossians chapter 2, 11 through 15. It says, "In him you also were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God who raised him from the dead. And you, who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him." I want to read verse 11 to you just in the Message. I know a lot of you have been following along this year in the Message 100. And I want to read Colossians 2:11, just this first verse in the Message, where Eugene Peterson translates it this way. He said, "Entering into this fullness is not something you figure out or achieve. It's not a matter of being circumcised or keeping a long list of laws." And see, this is important to recognize and understand, because we've all been told about the potential of knowing Jesus and living into his promises. Yet so many of us live disappointed in not making or experiencing those promises for ourselves. And what Paul is confronting here in Colossians is that this realm or this environment where God's promises come true, which is what the life of Jesus looked like, is an environment or a realm that cannot be achieved, that you can't figure it out on your own. And this is how we started the service off, the series off, by recognizing in Colossians 1 that you have to pray, and the word is almost demand, spiritual wisdom, spiritual wisdom and knowledge, so that you can know God's will, and in knowing God's will, all of those promises come to life. We said, and this is what is captured here by Eugene Peterson, that to be full, you have to be filled. Fullness is not something that you can find. That we're not going around looking for the right parts to put together ourselves and keep this whole thing together ourselves, or to build our own life, that we have to commit to being filled, that we have to recognize, according to Jeremiah chapter 2, that it's all about being filled, which implies there is someone and something that should fill us. And what Colossians is really confronting is just the fact that God is the eternal source of energy, and he's willing and wants to share his energy with us, but it's not something that we can go and buy or take so that we can keep it for ourselves and do it in our own timing. A couple of things that I want to point out to you. I think there's four main thoughts in these verses that I want to bring to your attention. And the first is that access cannot be earned. That access to God's kingdom cannot be earned. The kingdom has always been revealed, and it's why we call it revelation. This is true when it comes to Colossians 2, and we see it in Matthew 13:11, that the kingdom has to be revealed to us, that this invisible realm, this quantum realm where God's promises come true, where God's authority is the utmost authority, is something that we have to be invited into, that we have to surrender to, versus striving or working to earn or feel good about. That if you're going to enter the kingdom where God's plan for your life can be laid out for you, or you can walk in it, you have to understand that it has to be revealed to you, which requires submission. And this is just what is being said in Colossians 2, starting in verse 11. This isn't something that you can just go and do on your own. You can't just find the instructions. And Paul compares it to the Old Testament equivalent of circumcision. It was an outward sign, but in this case, this is something that Jesus invited us into, that is not an outward physical thing where you can just go and get it done and you're taken care of. And the beautiful thing about this is God's kingdom is so big, and it's ever expanding, and it's always moving, so that no matter how long you've known the Lord, or even how long you've participated in the kingdom, there's always more. And see, often in the kingdom, it's not an all or nothing. It's not a once and done. It's an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing relationship. And so maybe you experience the Lord in your 20s, and you've always been trying to get back to your 20s, to that place you were in the kingdom, or how you felt about your relationship with the Lord at that time. But the truth of the matter is God has a will, which is the kingdom, and the kingdom is moving today, and you're invited into what God is doing today, which means you have to surrender today, that you have to receive revelation, that you have to be connected to Him. And so no matter where you are right now, like even the problem that you're up against, even the frustration that you're dealing with, or the opportunity that's in front of you, this is true with the kingdom. Like, it's not going to be earned. You're not going to earn the right answers. You have to surrender to it and let the Lord reveal what the answer is. And it's why we end our time together each and every week just saying, God, what are you saying to me in light of what's being said? God already has an answer. He already has a direction. And He's dying to share it with you. But often what gets in the way of God's will is our own desire to be in control and do it our way in our time. And so the first point from this passage is that access to the kingdom, it can't be earned. Which should give you rest and a sense of peace, that you can't juggle well enough, or dance well enough, or work long enough. That there's a kingdom where this invisible authority and blessing and promises flow, that you just have to enter into. And you enter into it by surrendering to the Lord and saying, Lord, I want your will more than my own. I trust your will more than my own. Number two, it's connection over compliance. As human beings, we will always gravitate back toward morality-based living. Behavior modification. If I do this, I get this. I didn't do this, so I should get this. And what this passage points out is that it's connection over compliance. If you would spend the mental and emotional energy focusing on staying connected to the Lord and doing your best to hear what He's saying to you today, you would be far better off than trying to apply and be good and adhere to all of these different rules. It's not about rules. It's not about compliance. Paul addresses this throughout most of the New Testament. I think of Romans 14. Just about, it's the person who is weak that has to live by the rules. And it's not saying that there will not be things for you to comply with once you hear God's voice and God says, this is the way I want you to approach this. It's just important to keep things in order, that it's connection first, and then we comply with God's will. We don't live into the old letter of the law, doing things the way we've always done them, because that's the way we've always done them. The letter is dead, the spirit is alive. That's what Peter struggled with when God told him that he could eat whatever he wanted to. Peter tried to remind God of what God had said thousands of years ago. I think we do that too sometimes. We remind God of what he said to us a long time ago. And God said, in the same way you talked to your child when your child was 5 one way, and I want to talk to you this way when you're 25, give me the right to change what you think you heard. Some of us are stuck in and not experiencing the blessing or the promises or the grace that God has intended for us because we're clinging to something that he said to us 20 or 25 years ago. The Lord never changes. The Lord who he is never shifts or changes. But the way that the Lord communicates with us based on our spiritual maturity changes. Everything in the world is changing. The world is spinning. It's always moving. The Lord reserves the right to tell you something differently. The Lord reserves the right to contradict himself. You know this if you've ever been in class before. You know this if you've ever coached. You know this if you're a parent or a grandparent. Sometimes you tell your child or your player or your student something based on where they are to get them past where they're at, knowing that you will have to tell them more, which will seem like a contradiction when they finally advance. And see, what it really comes down to is our desire to be in control. And when we feel like we're out of control, we then all of a sudden feel like God's not in control. And nothing could be further from the truth. It is connection over compliance. God is much more concerned about your desire to stay connected than your desire to get everything right. Heaven can be brought to earth when you focus on staying connected versus complying with what everyone has always said to you. Make your burden staying connected, not complying with everything you read. Especially when God is saying other things to other people based on where they're at. And this is why energy, not evangelism, should be the epicenter of Christianity. Evangelism should be about sharing the energy and how we got to experience the energy that Colossians 1 says comes from the Father and was for Jesus. Your energy speaks much louder than your words. Your energy speaks much louder than your beliefs. Actually, your energy is a reflection of your beliefs. And so, again, nothing glorifies God more than you functioning at your full capacity. How do you function at your full capacity? You get in tune with the Lord's will for your life. And you get away from rules-based living and you emphasize staying connected. We don't have time to go into it today, but it's amazing how we make it about rules in order to feel better about ourselves. 3, debt reveals a lack of death. Debt reveals a lack of death. I had pulled up, I was trying to find things that people pay twice for. I don't know if you're like me, every once in a while you will see that you were charged twice for something when there was no need to pay for it twice. And I stumbled upon a Family Feud episode where the question was, what are people willing to pay double for? Do you want the answers? I thought it was really interesting as to what people were willing to pay double for. Until I deleted it. Nope, here it is. Number 1, what do you think people are willing to pay double for? By far. Number 1 was milk. Number 2, cigarettes. Number 3, survey says, painkillers. Number 4, the survey says, I can hear the bell between my ears, feminine products. I don't know. And number 5, chocolate. But debt reveals a lack of death. I was reading earlier this year the book that came out from the CIA investigator that was investigating and pursuing Jeffrey Epstein while he was still alive. And he wrote a book that the title is Dead Men Tell No Tales. And the idea is just he had to go away because of how much information he had on other people. And so the same is true when it comes to, and we see this here in Colossians, when it comes to people that cannot live into the freedom that God has given them. Jesus knew what you would do before you were born. He knew the good decisions you would make. He knew the bad decisions you would make. Jesus knows when you are going to give in and fail before you do. And knowing all of that beforehand, he still chose you and pursued you, and you responded to him pursuing you. We call it prevenient grace, which means you could not have responded to Jesus unless Jesus had first touched your heart and called you. Then Philippians 1:9 says, he is faithful to complete what he started in you. And so again, it should be really comforting to know that before I was ever responding to the Lord and having this idea of wanting to serve or love Jesus, Jesus saw everything that I would ever do wrong, and he still called me, and he still asks me to come closer. And so that being said, what Colossians says here is that when he died on our behalf, he wiped away all of our debt. He got rid of the legal demand that we were to pay because of our mistakes. And so here's my question. If Jesus paid a very expensive price with his blood for your mistakes, past, present, and future, why are you trying to pay for them a second time? Why do you keep trying to pay for them? How would you do that? You would do that by walking around mourning and giving attention to them all the time, or beating yourself up over them, or actually worshiping them. We tend to worship mistakes in religious environments at times. And as we've said here, especially when you start getting into energy and studying energy, you know that whatever you give your attention to, you give power to. Whatever you give your attention to, it grows. Because what you put your eyes on or what you give your attention to, you give power to. You give your energy to it. And so here we see that debt reveals a lack of depth. The only reason you're still worried about it is because you think that that mistake makes you less of a person. You think that that mistake means your love for Jesus is less. And Jesus said, hold on. I knew what you were going to do before you did it, and I knew what you were going to do before you were even aware of me calling you. If I've paid for it and I've wiped it out, I want you to spend your emotional energy on staying connected to me versus worrying about and beating yourself up over your inadequacies or where you're still growing. So debt, a sense of debt, spiritual debt, reveals a lack of depth. It means I'm still alive somewhere. I'm still trying to prove my worth. I'm still trying to be performance-driven. I still care about what other people think about me. What would it look like if we really lived into the idea that Jesus wiped away our sins and that they're forgiven? And this fourth point really builds on the third, and that's that the principalities, these invisible forces of darkness that want to stop or hold back the light, they need legal demands in order to exist. That sin or demons cannot beat you up if you don't have anything for them to stick to. And this was the magic of dying to yourself and being crucified. That Jesus took your sin and crucified it to his cross. When he died, he paid the price for your mistakes so that you wouldn't have to. And it doesn't mean that there are not consequences, that you don't feel the consequences of missing the mark. You do feel the consequences. But it means that you don't have to stay there, that you've been freed up to learn from it, so you don't have to keep missing the mark. The word sin we've just turned into its own thing. And it really was just like an archery term. It's hamartia. It just means you miss the bullseye. And missing the bullseye by a half an inch has its own consequences, and missing a bullseye by 15 feet has its consequences. And yet we've made it into this big thing in order to measure how serious someone is in their love for God. But yet we see Jesus in passages like John chapter 8 where he's freeing people up to invest their emotional energy on moving on from where they are without guilt or shame versus being loaded down with heavier burdens from religious people or religious leaders. He says to the woman there caught in the act of adultery, neither do I accuse you, go and sin no more. Romans 14:4, who are you to judge another person's servant? It is to that person's master that they stand or fall. And so what we're being invited into is to realize that our sin has already been paid for. Again, it doesn't mean that there are not consequences to missing the mark. And see, when you ask and you demand, God, I need spiritual wisdom and knowledge in order to know your will, it's once we know his will that we have an opportunity to prefer his voice or prefer our own, to prefer his experience and his vantage point or to prefer our own. And it is then when we choose self that we will deal with the ramifications of hamartia, missing the mark. God says, I want you to do it this way. I know it doesn't make sense to you because you can only see this dozen things or so. I see everything and I see everyone, and I'm leading you in a way that is going to be the most rewarding and the most efficient. I want you to do it my way. And we say, I've been hurt in the past. This is what makes the most sense to me. It seems like it's going to be a lot faster. I'm doing it this way. And we miss the mark. And there's a price to pay for missing the mark, even if it's just less than what could have been. Sometimes we never know the consequences of our sin, hamartia, because it's not something that goes into the negative as much as it is something that was not as positive or powerful as it could have been. God is not interested in reminding you of every time you've ever failed or how bad you failed. He's a loving Father that knew what you were going to do before you did it and knew what you were going to do before you were even born. There are no surprises to him. His invitation is for us to become efficient and to function at our full capacity. And that's why we've been saying that it is energy that should be at the epicenter. It should be what's measured when it comes to Christianity, not evangelism. How depressing to sell a lack of energy to people and tell them why they should be so excited to give their heart to Jesus and to walk an aisle and make a profession of faith to join the living dead. It's energy that should be at the epicenter of Christianity. I want what you have. Explain this to me. Why are you so joyful? Why are you resilient? How do you have so much grit? This picture that I put up here is a picture that a friend of mine sent me. I used to coach her in soccer 20 years ago. And she sent me a picture, and we had talked about the spiritual world and demons. And she sent me a picture one time and said, hey, is this what a demon looks like? And every once in a while, my experience has been, and somehow I'll figure out how to get this to those of you on Facebook. I know it's probably difficult to hear me talk about it and not see it, but she sent me this picture and said, is this what a demon looks like? And I said, absolutely. Sometimes if you have a couple of different angles or mirrors, you can catch what the supernatural looks like. And this is what a spirit looks like that was captured. And see, what Paul says is that sin needs something to stick to, that demons need something to accuse you of. And so when it comes to demonic forces or these spirits of darkness that are invisible and they're energetic, they are architects of arguments that can't be won. They love asking bad questions because there is no right answer to a bad question. Right? They'll remind you of what you don't have or what's going wrong when that's not what you should be thinking about. What you should be thinking about is God faithful? Is God my provider? Is God my protector? Can God make a way when there seems to be no way? Think about what the demonic forces would have been saying to Moses and the children of Israel as they're pinned in with the strongest army in the world right on their heels, and they're trapped right up against the Red Sea. Those demonic forces would have come up with, they were architects, they would have come up with all of the thoughts as to why they were going to die and why God had failed the children of Israel. And God just with one word says, stick your staff in the water. And all of a sudden, what was natural became supernatural, and they passed through on dry land. And so these demonic forces have to come up with arguments and tell you a narrative or a line that if you believe it, because it's natural, then you will become a victim of that energy. And so what the passage says here in Colossians 2 is that Jesus stripped these supernatural forces of darkness bare and paraded them through the streets, showing that they had no power. But the only way a demonic force or dark energy has no power over you is A, when you surrender your life to Jesus and do your best to be led by the Lord, and B, here's the big one, which could anything be bigger than Jesus' sacrifice for you so that you could enter into a relationship and be free from darkness? Answer? Yes! It was a trick question, kind of. You still play a part in this. And so if Jesus died on your behalf, but you don't receive the sacrifice, you can in some way cancel the effects of his sacrifice on your behalf. Some of us are still living beat up over mistakes that we made 20 years ago. And so sin never killed anyone. Guilt and shame kills a lot of people because we can't live into what Jesus did for us. So the Lord intends for us to move on. The Lord intends for us not to pay for something he paid for a second time. And the only thing that these demonic forces have that they can pin against you is what you're willing to keep in light of Jesus saying, I've forgiven you of that. Learn from it and move on. Woman, neither do I accuse you. Stop doing this and go on your way. Why? Because she recognized him as the Christ and he forgave it. I wrote here, and then we'll finish, that sin is not a something, but it needs a something in order to stay. You can't tell me what a sin is. You can't point to something like a red bicycle with a blue and a white wheel, and because it has one blue and one white, it's a sin. Like, there's nothing that you're going to be able to point to in and of itself and say, that's what sin looks like. Because sin is context. It's doing something right in the wrong context. And that's why we tend to stumble over this so much, is because we want to make sin a something. Pastor Charlie, I caught you for once. Pornography is a sin. No, pornography is a word that describes a lot of things that are happening at the same time. Two people making love has a right context that is godly. It is when it is out of context that it becomes sin. And so sin is not a something, and we would do well to recognize that, but it needs a something in order to stay. Meaning, we have to empower it in order for it to become a reality in our life. So, you make a mistake, God told you not to do it, you feel like you know what you were supposed to do in a certain situation, you did the opposite because you were fearful or worried, or you didn't get enough sleep, or maybe you were hangry, I don't know. And you did it anyways, and there was a consequence to it. And an hour, 2 hours, 2 days, or 2 years later, you're still thinking about it and beating yourself up from it. The reason why darkness is able to continue to hound you about that or plague you by that is because you haven't received the forgiveness that Jesus granted to you. Why? Because you love X's and O's. You love keeping score. Why do you love keeping score? Because you think you win more times than you lose. And so it's much easier to keep score and know that I'm ahead and I'm not losing than trust God with the invisible. Than trusting the Lord that your value is actually in who you are and who you belong to versus what you can do. And so sin is not a something, but it needs a something in order to stay. And so let me put this in context and we're finished. We talked about, just as we entered into this passage, that here's all of this energy that belongs to the Lord. He wants you to be like Jesus, and he wants to fill you with his light, life, and love, and have you share it with the rest of the world. That is the best form of evangelism. Then we're reminded here in chapter 2 of Colossians that we cannot go and earn that or grab it for ourselves or buy it. It has to be revealed to us through his will. Once we are being filled with the life of Jesus, it is going to make us move. It is going to get us out there sharing this light, life, and love with others. When you do that, because you are imperfect, you are going to make mistakes. The only thing that could slow you down or trip you up or start taking some of that energy back from you is if you were to start living into things that Jesus has already forgiven and holding them against yourself. So when you go to be an ambassador of eternal light life and love, you need to understand that you're not going to be perfect. Jesus says that's fine. You need to also understand at the same time, I knew every mistake you were ever going to make before you made it, and I forgave you of those things. Learn from missing the mark, but don't live underneath the weight of missing the mark. Sin is not a something, but it needs a something in order to stay. You will never give any hooks or handles to demonic forces of darkness if you can learn to live into the forgiveness Jesus gave you before you knew you even had it. Amen? Well, let's ask that question as we close our time together here this morning. God, what are you saying to me in light of what's been said? Whether you're in this room this morning or whether you're tuning in via Facebook, let's just take a moment to invite the Lord to search our heart. And more than anything that we've done wrong that would weigh us down or keep us from knowing the Lord's will, let's ask the Lord to reveal anything in us that we have yet to forgive ourselves for. Maybe it's something that you did that someone else has held over your head. And in order to get back into their good graces, you hold that same thing over your head. And the Lord doesn't want you to do that. And so, Lord, just real quick, we give you permission this morning to examine our hearts. Any words or accusations that anyone has spoken over us, maybe even a mom or a dad that loved us, that wants the best for us, but didn't know how to express their concern. We ask you right now, in the name of Jesus, to just reveal any part of our life that still has unforgiveness towards self, where we have yet to let go of our mistakes. Reveal that to us, Lord, and as you do, we're just going to give that back to you and receive the forgiveness that has already been granted to us in Jesus' name. Let's reflect for 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll close.
Okay, guys, a couple of announcements before we dismiss. Somehow the holidays are upon us, so our schedule, just mark your calendars, and don't worry, we'll repeat this 1 million more times in the coming weeks. But 3 weeks that we are not having prayer night, November 25th, in light of Thanksgiving, and then December 23rd and December 30th. We will not be having prayer night. Other than that, we are on. So this Wednesday, we will be here for prayer night, 7 o'clock. And then no Sunday services. We take the last Sunday of the year off just to give our staff a little bit of a break. And so we will not be having services December 27th. So you can go ahead and mark that on your calendar, continue to read the email, and listen to the announcements. We will be saying that many more times. Something else that you've heard me say before, December initiatives and breakouts. Now is the time to submit. If you're an owner, submit the initiative or breakout you would like to lead starting in December. So you can go onto our website, and there's a form that you can fill out. And if there's questions asked that you're not sure of, don't worry. Just do what you can. Flesh out your idea as much as you can, and then we'll help you kind of bring it to life so that you can lead our community in something that you're passionate about next month. And then giving. Last but certainly not least, as we have shared, we are completely dependent on your tithes and offerings. So you can give on our website. There's a bucket here if you are in-house that you can give, or you can text this number, 937-669-7066, to give. thank you so much for giving what you can to help us do what we do. That's all we have for you. Thank you for joining us. We will be back here next week. That schedule that Charlie mentioned, the switch up, it does not happen until December. So we're still on. This message will be at 10 a.m. next Sunday. So we will see you guys then. Have a good week.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us this morning and for participating in our conversation with your comments and your questions. As always, we would love it if you would share the link to today's message. If you need anything, you want to know more about who we are, you can visit our website at citychurchdayton.com or send us an email to info@citychurchdayton.com. Have a great week.